Subscribe to Storylab. Now, let's begin. The fluorescent lights in the conference room buzzed like trapped insects. Calvin Savage sat across from 3 clients, watching them argue over blueprint revisions for their downtown hotel renovation. 15 years ago, he'd sat in rooms where men discussed targets, not terrazzo flooring, where blueprints meant structural vulnerabilities, not aesthetic choices. Mr. Savage, your thoughts on the lobby's ceiling height? Calvin blinked, returning to the present. 18 feet. Anything lower feels oppressive. He tapped the blueprint. Your guests should feel welcomed, not contained. His phone vibrated. A text from Dwayne. Got an A on the history paper. Thanks for helping with the research. Calvin smiled. These moments, this normalcy, this was why he'd walked away from the agency. Why he turned in his credentials, buried his past, and learned to calculate load-bearing walls instead of enemy weak points. After the meeting, his colleague Mark Wagner caught him at the elevator. Drinks Friday? Jenny wants to introduce you to her sister again. I'm Mary, Mark. You know what I mean. Kristen's great, but doesn't her old man give you hell? Mark lowered his voice. Paul Schultz, federal prosecutor for 30 years. I looked him up. Guy put away some serious criminals. Retired now, Calvin said flatly. Yeah, but still, must be weird having that kind of father-in-law. Does he ever grill you about your past? I mean, before architecture, you were what exactly? Calvin's expression remained neutral, a skill that had kept him alive in Tehran, in Caracas, in places whose names were still classified. Consultant work, government contracts, boring stuff. The elevator doors opened. Calvin stepped in alone. At home, Dwayne was sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, some shooter game flickering across the screen. At 16, the kid had Calvin's dark hair and Kristen's sharp intelligence. Calvin had made sure Dwayne grew up soft. No military school, no combat training, no preparation for darkness. Just sports, good grades, normalcy. Hey, Dad, Mom's working late again. I'll start dinner. Calvin headed to the kitchen, then paused. That history paper, the one on interrogation techniques during World War II. Why that topic? Dwayne shrugged without looking away from the screen. Just seemed interesting. Mr. Henderson said I should research something unexpected. Calvin's jaw tightened. Jordan Henderson taught at Dwayne's school, but the name came with weight. Jordan's father Marcus had done time for a crime he didn't commit, prosecuted by Paul Schultz 20 years ago. The case had been overturned eventually, but by then, Marcus had lost everything. Small world. Or maybe not so small. The doorbell rang at 7. Calvin knew who it was before opening it. Paul Schultz stood there in his tailored suit, Deborah beside him with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Calvin. Paul's handshake was aggressive, testing. At 68, the man still carried himself like he owned every room. Hope we're not intruding. Deborah wanted to see Kristen, and I thought I'd check in on my grandson. Of course. Come in. Calvin stepped aside, noting how Deborah flinched when Paul's hand touched her back. Subtle. Most people wouldn't catch it. Paul made himself comfortable in Calvin's recliner, surveying the living room like a judge reviewing evidence. Dwayne, turn that garbage off. Come talk to your grandfather. Dwayne hesitated, glancing at Calvin. It's fine, Calvin said quietly. As Dwayne sat, Paul leaned forward. 16 years old. You should be outside building something, getting your hands dirty, not rotting in front of screens. You were wasting time. Paul's voice had that prosecutor's edge. When I was your age, I worked construction summers. Learned what real work meant. Your father understands, don't you, Calvin? Oh, wait. You spend your 20s and 30s doing, what was it again? Government consulting? Calvin met Paul's eyes. The old man knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to probe. I help keep people safe, Calvin said evenly. By sitting in offices? Paul's smile was predatory. Strange career change. Government work to architecture. Unless the government work wasn't just paperwork. Must have been something more hands-on. Deborah cleared her throat. Paul, please. We came for a nice visit. I'm making conversation, Deborah. Paul didn't look at his wife. His focus stayed on Calvin. I'm just saying, a man needs to maintain certain skills. Can't let yourself go soft. Can't let your son grow up soft either. Calvin felt the old training kick in, reading threats, calculating responses, identifying pressure points. Paul's larynx, the median nerve cluster in his wrist, the way he favored his left knee when he walked. Stop. That wasn't who he was anymore. Dwayne's doing fine, Calvin said. Straight A's. Track team. Good kid. Good isn't excellent. And kids need discipline. Paul stood, walked to where Dwayne sat, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, too firm, fingers digging in. Real discipline. The kind that builds character. Maybe I should spend more time with him. Teach him what his father seems reluctant to. Dwayne tensed under the grip. Calvin saw the discomfort flash across his son's face. I appreciate the offer, Calvin said carefully, but we have things handled. Do you? Paul finally released Dwayne's shoulder. Because from where I'm standing, you've raised a soft boy in a hard world. That's dangerous, Calvin. Makes him a target. Paul. Deborah started. Quiet. The single word made her shrink. Years of conditioning. Calvin walked to the door, opened it. I think it's time you both headed out. Kristen will be home soon, and we have an early morning. Paul's expression darkened. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Calvin saw the real man underneath. Control. Dominance. The need to break anything that didn't submit. Of course, Paul said smoothly, the mask returning. But Calvin, remember, boys need strong men in their lives, not architects. He paused at the door. I'll be around more often. For Dwayne's sake. After they left, Dwayne exhaled. Grandpa's intense. Yeah. Calvin locked the door, watched through the window as Paul's Mercedes pulled away. He is. Listen, if he ever makes you uncomfortable. It's fine, Dad. He's just old school, right? Calvin wanted to say more, but Kristen's car pulled into the driveway. She came in looking exhausted, her hospital scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift. Your parents were here, Calvin said. The light in her eyes dimmed. How bad? Paul has ideas about spending more time with Dwayne. Kristen sat heavily on the couch. He does this, pushes boundaries until. She trailed off, but Calvin knew the rest. Until he gets what he wants. Until everyone bends. That night, lying beside Kristen, Calvin stared at the ceiling. His phone showed old contacts he hadn't called in years. Anthony Lehman, Sam Castro, others who understood what he'd been, what he could still do if necessary. No, that life was over. Paul was just a domineering old man. Manageable. Containable. Calvin closed his eyes, unaware that in 3 days, he'd realize how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. The morning arrived too bright. Calvin woke to find Kristen already gone, another early shift. Dwayne was eating cereal, scrolling through his phone with that vacant teenager expression. Dad? Grandpa texted. Want me to come over Saturday? Help him with some project. Calvin poured coffee, buying time. What kind of project? Dunno. Yard work maybe. Every instinct screamed refusal, but Calvin saw the trap. Say no, and Kristen would ask why. Paul would position it as Calvin being overprotective, unreasonable, and Calvin would have no concrete reason beyond gut feeling. I'll come with you, Calvin said. That's kind of weird, Dad. I'm 16. Humor me. Saturday came. Paul's house sat in an old money neighborhood, the kind where every lawn was manicured and every neighbor minded their own business. As they pulled up, Calvin noticed Paul watching from the window. Deborah answered the door, her smile brittle. Calvin, I didn't know you'd be joining. Thought I'd help out. Calvin followed her inside, noting the fresh flowers on the table, the spotless kitchen. Everything perfect, everything controlled. Paul appeared from his study, and something flickered across his face when he saw Calvin. Annoyance. Then it smoothed over. This was supposed to be grandfather-grandson time. Just being involved, Calvin said mildly. The project turned out to be organizing Paul's garage, clearly busy work. Calvin watched as Paul directed Dwayne, his command sharp, his criticism constant. Not there. Are you blind? Stack them properly. When I was your age, I understood basic spatial reasoning. Dwayne bit his lip, complying. Calvin's hands tightened into fists, relaxed, tightened again. This was psychological testing. Paul was probing for reactions, establishing dominance. After an hour, Calvin's phone rang. His firm, actual emergency with a client site. I need to handle this, Calvin said. Won't be long. We'll be fine, Paul said, that smile again. Won't we, Dwayne? Calvin hesitated. Dwayne nodded. It's cool, Dad. The meeting pulled Calvin away for 2 hours. When he returned, Dwayne was quiet in the car. Too quiet. Everything okay? Yeah. But Dwayne rubbed his arm, and when he shifted, he winced. Let me see. Dad, it's nothing. Calvin pulled over, turned on the dome light. Dwayne's arm showed finger-shaped bruises. Fresh. What happened? I dropped a box. Grandpa grabbed me to keep it from falling. No big deal. But Calvin knew grip strength. Knew the difference between catching someone and hurting them. This was the latter. Dwayne, please don't make it a thing. Mom's already stressed with Grandpa, and it was just an accident. Calvin drove home in silence, rage building beneath his carefully maintained surface. That night, he lay awake planning confrontations, then dismissing them. Any accusation would fracture Kristen's family. Paul would deny, call Calvin paranoid, make him the villain. Calvin needed proof, or he needed Paul to reveal himself completely. Monday brought a wrinkle. Calvin's firm landed a major contract, convention center in Phoenix. Site visit required, presentations, meetings, 3 days minimum. I can't leave right now, Calvin told Mark. You're the lead architect. They want you specifically. Mark studied him. What's going on? You've been off since that presentation. Calvin couldn't explain. Couldn't say that every instinct honed through years of reading Dangerous Men told him Paul Schultz was escalating towards something. Couldn't admit he was afraid to leave his son alone. But refusing would tank the project. Cost jobs. Calvin was being paranoid, letting his past color his present. Paul was just a difficult old man. Plenty of kids dealt with worse grandparents. He took the assignment. The Phoenix meetings consumed Wednesday and Thursday. Calvin called home twice daily. Kristen sounded normal. Dwayne sounded normal. Everything was fine, except it wasn't. Thursday night, Calvin woke at 3 a.m. in his hotel room. No alarm, no noise. Just that sixth sense developed in places where sleeping too deeply meant dying. He called home. No answer. Called Kristen's cell. Voicemail. Probably nothing. Night shift. Phone on silent. But Calvin was already booking the earliest flight back. He landed Friday at noon, drove straight home. The house looked normal. Quiet. Calvin opened the door, and the world tilted. The smell hit him first, copper and salt. Blood. Not fresh, but recent. His training took over instantly, senses amplifying. He moved through the living room, cleared it. Dining room, empty. Kitchen. Dwayne lay on the tile floor. Calvin dropped to his knees, hands automatically checking vitals even as his mind cataloged injuries. Face swollen, left eye nearly shut. Split lip. The way Dwayne held his ribs suggested fractures. Defensive bruising on his forearms. Belt marks across his back visible through his torn shirt. Dwayne's good eye opened. Dad. Barely a whisper. I'm here. I'm here. What, who? Grandpa. Dwayne coughed, winced. He came over. Said Mom asked him to check on me. I told him I was fine. He got angry. Said I disrespected him. That you made me weak. That he'd fix what you failed to do. The front door closed. Calvin's head snapped up. Paul Schultz stood there, belt still in hand. Calm. Almost pleased. Calvin. You're back early. Calvin stood slowly. Every muscle in his body coiled tight. The part of him that had been dormant for 15 years. The part that made terrorists cry. That made cartel bosses give up family members. That made trained soldiers break. Surfaced like a shark rising from deep water. He disrespected me. Paul said conversationally. Someone needed to teach him proper behavior. Since you clearly weren't going to. Kristen, Calvin said, voice absolutely level. Take Dwayne upstairs. Lock the bedroom door. Call 911 in exactly 3 hours. Not before. Kristen appeared from the hallway, where she'd been frozen. Her face was pale, shocked. She'd come home to find her father beating her son, had been too paralyzed to intervene. Calvin. Now. She moved, helping Dwayne up. The boy groaned with every movement. As they reached the stairs, Calvin heard Dwayne ask, Mom, what's Dad going to do? Kristen's voice shook. What he should have done the first time my father hurt me. The bedroom door closed. Locked. Calvin walked to the front door, locked it, drew the curtains, turned to face Paul, who still stood there with that arrogant certainty. "You don't scare me," Paul said. "Whatever you did for the government, you're soft now. 15 years playing with blueprints. You don't have it anymore." Calvin smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You wanted to teach my son a lesson about strength? About respect?" He moved closer, and for the first time, something flickered in Paul's eyes. "Now it's my turn to teach you." Paul swung the belt. Calvin caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted. The belt clattered to the floor. Before Paul could react, Calvin had him in a compliance hold. Not enough to damage, just enough to control, to demonstrate the shift in power. "Here's what's going to happen," Calvin said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm he'd used in black sites, in interrogation rooms, in places that didn't exist on any map. "You're going to learn what it feels like to be helpless, to have someone larger and stronger impose their will on you, to beg and have your pleas ignored. I'll have you arrested. With what evidence? You attacked my son in my home. There's a blood trail from the kitchen to here. Dwayne's injuries speak for themselves. I'm defending my family." Calvin forced Paul down into a chair, used zip ties from his workshop to secure him. Paul struggled, and Calvin let him. Let him understand the futility. "Do you know what I really did for 15 years? Calvin asked. "I made people talk. People trained to resist torture. People who'd been hardened by war, by ideology, by hatred. And I broke all of them. Not through violence alone. Though I learned every pressure point, every stress position, every physiological response to pain. No, I broke them psychologically. Made them want to tell me secrets. Made them beg to cooperate." Paul's face had gone pale. "You're insane. You wanted the monster. You poked and prodded and pushed until you woke it up." Calvin leaned close. "The difference between you and me? I became a monster to protect the innocent. You became one because you enjoy the power." What happened over the next 3 hours was surgical. Calvin didn't lose control. That was the terrifying part. He remained absolutely calm, methodical, as he systematically dismantled Paul Schultz's sense of superiority. He started with stress positions, made Paul hold uncomfortable poses until muscles screamed. When Paul refused, Calvin didn't hit him. He simply applied pressure to nerve clusters, agonizing but leaving no marks. He asked questions about every person Paul had hurt, every defendant he'd railroaded, every family member he'd abused. And Paul, faced with someone who truly understood fear, began to talk. "The Henderson case, I knew Marcus was innocent, but I needed a conviction for my election campaign. So I buried evidence. How many others? 7, maybe 8. I don't remember them all." Calvin documented everything on his phone, voice-activated recording. Paul's confessions, his justifications, his complete moral bankruptcy laid bare. As the hours passed, Paul cried, begged, promised to change. Calvin had heard it all before, from worse men in worse places. At the 2-hour 45-minute mark, Calvin heard sirens in the distance. Right on time. He'd called 911 from Dwayne's phone before starting, left it connected. Everything that had happened in this room was now recorded with dispatch. Paul's hands. Calvin had been careful with those. Crushed some of the small bones. Not enough to completely destroy, but enough that gripping anything would be agony for months. Maybe forever if the damage was permanent. Paul would never hold a belt again. Never grip anyone in violence. When police crashed through the door, Calvin was sitting calmly at his kitchen table, coffee in hand. Paul was still zip-tied to the chair, unconscious from shock and pain. "My father-in-law attacked my son," Calvin said evenly, showing them Dwayne's injuries, the belt, the blood. "I restrained him until you arrived." The responding officers, Troy Bridges and Brandon Owens, took statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Dwayne's injuries, the belt. Paul's history became relevant when one of the EMTs recognized him and muttered, "That's the prosecutor who sent my cousin away." Guy was innocent. At the hospital, doctors cataloged Paul's injuries. Multiple fractures in both hands. Severe muscle strain. Psychological trauma. No life-threatening damage, but enough to ensure months of recovery. "How'd this happen?" the ER doctor asked. "He fell," Paul whispered. Even broken, he understood. If he admitted what happened, He'd have to admit why it happened. Would have to explain attacking a teenage boy. The doctor looked skeptical, but wrote it down. Calvin returned home as dawn broke. Kristen and Dwayne were still upstairs. He found them sitting together on Dwayne's bed, holding each other. "It's over," Calvin said. Dwayne looked at his father with new eyes. "What did you do? What needed to be done?" Calvin sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry you saw that side of me. Sorry you had to learn I'm capable of." "Dad." Dwayne's voice was firm despite the split lip. "He beat me. You stopped him. You protected me." Kristen touched Calvin's face. "All those years ago, when we met, and you told me you'd walked away from something dark to build a better life. I never fully understood. But tonight, you went back to that darkness to protect our son. I don't regret it," Calvin said. "I'd do it again." Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Normal people heading to normal jobs, unaware that in this house, a predator had been stopped, that a monster had been necessary to defeat a monster. Calvin knew this wasn't over. Paul had resources, connections. He'd retaliate somehow. But for now, his family was safe. And Calvin Savage, former CIA interrogator turned architect, was prepared to do whatever necessary to keep it that way. 3 days after the incident, detectives Joshua Fry and Gilbert O'Neill sat in Calvin's living room. Fry was mid-40s with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. O'Neill was younger, sharper, taking notes on everything. "Let's go over this again," Fry said. "You came home, found your son beaten, confronted your father-in-law, and restrained him." "That's correct. For 3 hours. I wanted to ensure he couldn't harm anyone else before police arrived." O'Neill looked up from his notes. "Mr. Savage, Paul Schultz has 17 fractures in his hands. Severe nerve damage. He's claiming you tortured him." Calvin met O'Neill's gaze steadily. "He attacked my 16-year-old son with a belt. Split his ribs, nearly blinded him. I used reasonable force to subdue an aggressor in my home. Is Mr. Schultz pressing charges?" Fry and O'Neill exchanged glances. His lawyers advised him not to. "Probably because your son's injuries are well documented and self-defense laws in this state are permissive. Plus," Fry added, leaning back, "we ran Paul Schultz's name through the system. Interesting history. Lot of overturned convictions from his time as a prosecutor. Some complaint from his office staff about hostile work environment. In your 911 call, dispatch recorded the entire altercation. Hard to claim torture when we have audio of you defending yourself." Calvin had counted on that. The 911 recording captured Paul's threats, his admission of beating Dwayne, his attempts to attack Calvin. What it didn't capture clearly were the specifics of what Calvin did. Careful positioning and precise interrogation techniques that left minimal evidence. "We spoke with your son," O'Neill said. "Brave kid. Clear statement about what his grandfather did. Also spoke with your wife. She corroborated everything." Fry stood. "Here's how this plays out. Paul Schultz goes down for felony assault of a minor. You get a pass on the excessive force because legally you were defending your home and family. But Mr. Savage," he paused, "whatever you really did in that government consulting job, keep it locked down. Paul's lawyer is digging, and if they find ammunition, they'll use it." After the detectives left, Calvin found Kristen in the kitchen, staring at nothing. "I knew my father was cruel," she said quietly. "Growing up, She stopped, gathered herself. "There were incidents. My mother and I learned to avoid setting him off. But I thought with time, with grandchildren, he'd softened. Abusers don't soften. They just find new victims. When I came home and saw Dwayne on the floor, saw my father standing there so calm, so righteous." Kristen's hands shook. "Part of me wanted to stop you. Part of me wanted to help you hurt him worse." Calvin pulled her close. "You don't have to feel guilty for that. My mother called. She wants to see you." Deborah Schultz arrived that afternoon, looking smaller somehow, without Paul's presence dominating space. She seemed almost translucent. "I'm filing for divorce," she said without preamble. "My lawyer says Paul's criminal charges will help expedite things." "Good," Kristen said. Deborah's eyes were red. "I should have left years ago, after the first time he hit me, or the times he—" She looked at Kristen. "You were 12 when I realized he was doing the same to you. I told myself it wasn't that bad. that he provided for us, that no one would believe me against a federal prosecutor. Mom, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I enabled him. Let him hurt my daughter because I was too afraid to leave. Deborah turned to Calvin. What you did, what I heard happened. Thank you. Someone should have stopped him decades ago. After Deborah left, Calvin received a call from an unknown number. Mr. Savage? This is Renee Atkins. I was Paul Schultz's assistant for 15 years. Calvin put the call on speaker so Kristen could hear. I heard about what happened to your son, Renee continued. I'm sorry, but I'm calling because Paul wasn't just a bad boss. He was corrupt. I have documentation, emails, recorded conversations, evidence he deliberately prosecuted innocent people. Why didn't you come forward before? Fear. He had connections everywhere. But now that he's charged, now that he's vulnerable, I thought you should know. In case he tries to retaliate, you'll have leverage. Calvin met Renee at a coffee shop downtown. She was in her 50s, professional, with the cautious demeanor of someone used to watching her words. She slid a flash drive across the table. 7 cases where Paul knowingly prosecuted innocent defendants. He'd bury exculpatory evidence, threaten witnesses, fabricate testimony, all to maintain his conviction rate. Jesus, Calvin breathed, skimming through the files on her laptop. Names jumped out. Marcus Henderson, Anthony Lehman, Sam Castro, people whose lives Paul had destroyed for career advancement. Why those 7 specifically? They were vulnerable, poor defendants with public defenders. Cases where Paul knew no one would dig too deep. Renee's jaw tightened. I tried to speak up once. He threatened my career, my family, so I kept quiet and documented everything. Waited for the right moment. And that moment is now. He beat a child, his own grandson. That's who Paul really is, someone who hurts the vulnerable and calls it strength. She closed the laptop. Use it however you need to. That evening, Calvin sat with a flash drive, contemplating his next move. The evidence could destroy Paul completely, end his pension, expose his legacy, potentially lead to criminal charges beyond the assault. But it could also paint a target on Calvin's back. Paul still had allies, people who'd benefited from his corrupt prosecutions, who'd want this buried. What are you thinking? Kristen asked. That Paul won't let this go. He'll see his arrest as temporary. Once he recovers, he'll come after us legally, financially, however he can. So what do? Calvin looked at the flash drive. We make sure he can't. The next morning, Calvin reached out to someone he hadn't contacted in 15 years. Anthony Lehman answered on the 3rd ring. Savage. Heard your name recently. Interesting situation with your father-in-law. How did you? I keep tabs on former colleagues, especially the good ones. Lehman's voice was warm, familiar. Paul Schultz. I remember that name. He prosecuted me in '09 on fabricated weapons charges. I was running an op, and he nearly blew my cover for his conviction numbers. You're on the list then? What list? Calvin explained Renee's evidence. The 7 cases. The pattern of corruption. Lehman whistled. That's federal. Career-ending. Possibly prison-worthy if handled right. I need advice. Do I leak this? Go to the media? Federal investigators. You do nothing, Lehman said firmly. You give it to me. I've got contacts at DOJ who wanted to nail Schultz for years, but lacked evidence. They'll open an investigation quietly. Build a case properly. No blowback on you or your family. Why help me? Because Paul Schultz destroyed 7 innocent people's lives that we know of. Probably more. And because you walked away from the life and built something good. I respect that. Let me protect it. Calvin sent the files to Lehman through encrypted channels. Then he waited. 2 days later, Paul was released from the hospital. His hands were casted, his movement limited, but his fury was evident. He held a press conference from his lawyer's office. Calvin Savage is a dangerous man, Paul declared to local news cameras. He attacked me without provocation, nearly killed me. I want the district attorney to file charges for attempted murder. The lawyer, Dale Combs, expensive and connected, nodded along. We're exploring all legal options. My client is a respected former prosecutor who was brutally assaulted in his son-in-law's home. Kristen watched the press conference with growing anger. He's spinning it, making himself the victim. Calvin remained calm. Let him. The more noise he makes, the more attention he draws. And attention is the last thing he can afford right now. That night, two men approached Calvin as he left his office. They wore suits, but had the bearing of ex-military or law enforcement. Not threatening, but not friendly either. Mr. Savage? We're friends of Paul Schultz. He wanted us to deliver a message. Calvin assessed them quickly. Both armed, shoulder holsters right-handed. One had boxer's hands, the other moved like he'd done MMA. Dangerous if this went physical. I'm listening. Drop the charges. Convince your son to recant, or things get complicated for your family. Calvin tilted his head. Things are already complicated. My son has broken ribs. My father-in-law is facing felony charges. But since you're here, let me share some information. He pulled out his phone, showed them a photo. Brandon Owens, you on the left. Former cop, fired for excessive force. Now you do freelance intimidation work. He swiped to the next photo. And Troy Bridges, security consultant. Interesting resume, 3 domestic violence complaints that got buried. Both men stiffened. Before you ask how I know this, understand that I spent 15 years learning to find people's secrets. Every person has vulnerabilities. Yours are well documented. Calvin put his phone away. So here's my message for Paul. If anyone in my family gets so much as a parking ticket that smells suspicious, I release everything I have on him and everyone connected to him. We clear. Owens and Bridges exchanged glances. They come expecting a civilian architect. Found something else entirely. Crystal, Owens muttered. They left. Calvin waited until they were gone before his hand shook. The old instincts were still there, sharp as ever. But using them felt like putting on clothes that didn't fit anymore, functional but wrong. He called Kristen. We need to talk about security. Paul's escalating. They installed a home security system that night. Cameras. Motion sensors. Calvin also reached out to Sam Castro, another former colleague who now ran a private security firm. I can have someone watching your house within the hour, Sam offered. Discreet. Professional. Just for a few weeks. Until this settles. Calvin, guys like Schultz don't settle. They dig in. You know that. Calvin didn't know that, which was why his next call was to Jordan Henderson, Dwayne's history teacher. Mr. Henderson, this is Calvin Savage, Dwayne's father. I need to ask you about your father's case. The one Paul Schultz prosecuted. There was a long pause. Why? Because I have evidence that proves your father was innocent. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Paul Schultz really is. Jordan Henderson met Calvin at a quiet bar downtown. He was in his 40s, carrying the weight of a name that had been dragged through mud. My father died in prison, Jordan said without preamble. Heart attack at 53. He went in innocent, came out in a casket. Paul Schultz killed him as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. Calvin slid a folder across the table. Proof. Evidence that was buried during trial. Witness statements that were never disclosed. All of it. Jordan read through the documents, hands shaking. How did you get this? Someone who worked for Paul kept records. Someone with a conscience. And you're sharing this with me because Paul attacked my son, and because I believe in balancing scales. Calvin leaned forward. I'm giving the same evidence to 6 other families. People Paul destroyed. When this goes public, it won't just be assault charges. It'll be a pattern of corruption spanning decades. Jordan closed the folder carefully. What do you need from me? Help coordinating with the other victims. Creating a unified front. Making sure Paul can't isolate or silence anyone. Consider it done. Jordan extended his hand. Thank you. For my father. For all of us. Over the next week, Calvin quietly contacted the other 6 families from Renee's list. Each meeting was similar. Shock, anger, gratitude. Each family had suffered because of Paul's ambition. Lost years, lost money, lost lives. By Friday, they had a coalition. 8 families ready to go public. Jordan Henderson organized a press conference for the following Monday. But Paul wasn't idle. His lawyer filed a civil suit against Calvin for $5 million in damages. Restraining order requests. Custody challenges. Arguing that Calvin was dangerous and shouldn't be around Dwayne unsupervised. It's all smoke, Calvin's lawyer, Mark Wagner's wife, actually explained. He's trying to bury you in legal costs. Make you drop the criminal charges to make the civil suit go away. Not happening. Sunday night, Calvin's security cameras caught movement. A car circling the block 3 times. Park across the street. 2 figures approaching the house. Calvin was ready. He'd been waiting for this. As the figures reached his porch, motion lights flooded the area. Calvin opened the door. Sam Castro beside him. It was Owens and Bridges again. But this time they looked nervous. "We're done," Owens said quickly. "Paul can't pay us what he promised. And word is DOJ is sniffing around his old cases. We're out." "Smart move," Calvin said. After they left, Sam chuckled. That was anticlimactic. Paul's losing his support structure. Money gets tight when legal bills pile up. Associates jump ship when federal investigations start. You plan this. I learned from the best. Cut off resources. Isolate the target. Apply pressure until they break. Monday morning brought the press conference. Jordan Henderson stood at a podium, 7 other families beside him. They told their stories, lives destroyed by Paul Schultz's corruption, evidence withheld, witnesses threatened, innocents ignored for conviction statistics. Local news covered it, then regional. By afternoon, national outlets picked up the story. Retired federal prosecutor accused of decades of corruption. Paul's lawyer tried damage control, but the evidence was overwhelming. Renee Adkins provided documentation. Families provided testimony. And then the DOJ announced they were opening an official investigation into Paul Schultz's conduct during his prosecutorial career. Calvin watched it unfold from his office. Mark stood beside him, impressed. "You destroyed him," Mark said. "Completely. He destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone could see it." That night, Paul called Calvin's cell. Calvin almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "You think you've won?" Paul's voice was ragged, desperate. "You've taken everything from me. My reputation, my career, my family. But I still have one move left." "And what's that?" "Mutually assured destruction. I know what you did overseas. I've been digging. Tehran, 2011. That black site in Morocco. I'll expose you. Ruin you just like you've ruined me." Calvin's voice remained calm. "Go ahead. Release whatever you found. Because here's the thing, Paul. I was authorized for everything I did. Operating under legal directives from the highest levels. You won't find anything criminal because I was doing my job protecting American interests. You, on the other hand, broke the law for personal gain. We're not the same. I'll make sure everyone knows what a monster you are. People already know I'm dangerous. That's why my son is safe and yours is terrified of you." Calvin paused. "You lose, Paul. Accept it." He hung up. 2 days later, Paul Schultz suffered stroke. The stress, the medications, the mounting pressure, his body gave out. He survived, but was left partially paralyzed, speech slurred, confined to a wheelchair. Deborah filed for divorce while he was in ICU. Kristen didn't visit. Dwayne didn't ask to. And Calvin Savage, former CIA interrogator, returned to his blueprints and his family, knowing that sometimes monsters are necessary to stop monsters, but also knowing the cost of becoming one again. The federal courthouse in downtown was all marble and flags, the kind of building designed to intimidate. Calvin sat in the back row of the gallery, watching as prosecutors laid out their case against Paul Schultz. 2 months had passed since the stroke. Paul sat at the defense table in his wheelchair, a blanket across his lap, one side of his face drooping. He could barely speak. His lawyer did most of the talking, but his eyes still held that fury, that refusal to accept defeat. The prosecution called their first witness, Marcus Henderson, Jordan's father. Except Marcus wasn't dead. That had been the biggest revelation. "Mr. Henderson, can you explain how you're here today when records show you died in prison?" Marcus was thin, gray-haired, but very much alive. Mistaken identity. Another inmate with a similar name died. Prison administration mixed up the records. By the time it was discovered, I'd already been transferred to a different facility under witness protection. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. The judge gavelled for silence. "Why witness protection, Mr. Henderson?" "Because Paul Schultz tried to have me killed in prison. When I started filing appeals, proving my innocence, he panicked. Had me attacked by another inmate who owed him favors." Calvin leaned forward. This was new information, even to him. Objection. Paul's lawyer, now Trevor Jacobson, since Dale Combs had quietly withdrawn, shot to his feet. Baseless accusations without evidence. We have evidence, Your Honor. The prosecutor held up a file. Prison records showing financial transactions between Paul Schultz and the family of inmate Matthew Kelly, who assaulted Mr. Henderson 3 days before the attack. Phone records, bank statements, all pointing to a conspiracy to silence a witness. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified. The 7 families. Renee Adkins with her documentation. Police officers who'd been pressured to falsify reports. Defense attorneys who'd been intimidated into poor representation. And then Dwayne took the stand. Calvin watched his son walk to the witness box, still moving carefully. Ribs healed, but the memory of pain lingered. Dwayne had grown in these months. Stood straighter. Spoke clearer. The beating had changed him, but not broken him. Can you describe what happened on the afternoon of November 15th? The prosecutor asked gently. Dwayne's voice was steady. My grandfather came to the house. Said my mom asked him to check on me. When I said I was fine, he got angry. Started yelling about how I was weak. Then my father had made me soft. What happened next? He took off his belt. Told me he was going to teach me what real strength looked like. Dwayne met Paul's eyes across the courtroom. Then he beat me. I tried to defend myself, but he was bigger, stronger. He didn't stop until I couldn't fight back anymore. And when your father arrived, he sent my mom to call the police. Then he made sure my grandfather could never hurt anyone again. Objection. Jacobson stood. The defendant's actions are not on trial here. They are when they demonstrate a pattern. The prosecutor countered. Paul Schultz spent decades using violence and intimidation to control others. The assault on his grandson is simply the most recent example. The judge allowed the testimony to continue. Calvin was called next. He'd been dreading this, having to explain those 3 hours without revealing the full extent of his training. Mr. Savage, you restrained Paul Schultz for approximately 3 hours. Can you explain why? I wanted to ensure he couldn't harm my son further or escape before police arrived. I used minimum necessary force to keep him contained. The medical reports show 17 fractures in Mr. Schultz's hands. How do you explain that? Calvin met the prosecutor's eyes. They'd rehearsed this. Mr. Schultz was violent, aggressive. He attempted to attack me multiple times. During one struggle, I defended myself, and he injured his hand against the furniture. It was a lie. Everyone in the courtroom probably knew it was a lie. But legally, it was defensible. The defense tried to paint Calvin as the real aggressor, but between the 9/11 recording, Dwayne's injuries, and Paul's history of violence, the narrative didn't stick. Isn't it true, Mr. Savage, that you have extensive training in interrogation and torture techniques? I work for the government in intelligence capacity. My work is classified, but you use those techniques on my client. I used reasonable force to protect my family. Nothing more. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. 7 counts of prosecutorial misconduct, conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness tampering, and the assault on Dwayne, felony assault and battery of a minor. The judge set sentencing for the following month. Paul was released on bond due to his medical condition, but confined to house arrest with electronic monitoring. Calvin knew Deborah had already moved out, filing paperwork to ensure she'd get nothing of his in the divorce. 3 weeks later, Calvin received an unexpected visitor at his office. An older woman, professionally dressed, with kind eyes. Mr. Savage? I'm Sally Fowler. I was one of Paul Schultz's victims. Case from 1998. Calvin invited her in, offered coffee. I wanted to thank you, Sally said, for exposing him. I spent 5 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Lost my children, my career, my life. When I got out, I tried to rebuild, but the conviction followed me everywhere. I'm sorry that happened to you. It wasn't your fault. But your actions, collecting the evidence, organizing the families, standing up to him, you gave us all justice we never thought we'd see. She paused. I also wanted to warn you. Paul has friends, people who benefited from his corruption. Judge Everett Lawson, Detective Joseph May. Others who are nervous about what might come out if Paul decides to talk. You think they'll come after me? I think they'll try to discredit you. Make the trial about you instead of Paul. Sally leaned forward. Be careful. Victory isn't final until sentencing is done. She was right to warn him. That week, stories began appearing in local media. Reformed CIA operative or dangerous vigilante? Articles questioning Calvin's past. Anonymous sources claiming he'd committed war crimes. Suggesting his attack on Paul was unprovoked, excessive. Calvin recognized the campaign for what it was. Character assassination coordinated by Paul's remaining allies. Judge Lawson had connections to several news outlets. Detective May had fed stories to crime reporters for years. Mark confronted Calvin at the office. These stories, are they true? Did you do the things they're implying? I did things I'm not proud of. In service of my country. Under legal authority. But nothing criminal. They're trying to make you look like the bad guy. Because they can't defend Paul's actions, so they attack the messenger. Calvin decided to get ahead of the narrative. He gave an interview to a national news outlet, carefully crafted with his lawyer present. Mr. Savage, these reports claim you tortured your father-in-law. What's your response? I defended my son who was beaten nearly to death by a man who spent decades abusing his power. Was I aggressive in restraining him? Yes. Did I use my training to ensure he couldn't hurt anyone else? Absolutely. Would I do it again to protect my family? Without hesitation. And your CIA background? I served my country in difficult circumstances. I followed the law and my conscience. When I felt that work was compromising my values, I left and built a different life. But I don't regret using my skills to protect an innocent child. The interview resonated. Public opinion, which had been wavering, swung back in Calvin's favor. Parents especially connected with the idea of doing whatever necessary to protect your children. Judge Lawson and Detective May retreated, realizing their campaign was backfiring. Sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was packed. Victims, families, media, curious observers. Paul sat in his wheelchair, looking diminished. The stroke had aged him decades. The judge, not Lawson, but an impartial jurist brought in from another district, reviewed the case thoroughly before speaking. Paul Schultz, you spent 30 years in a position of trust and authority. You were supposed to seek justice, to protect the innocent, to uphold the law. Instead, you perverted every principle you swore to defend. You destroyed lives for personal gain. You silenced witnesses, buried evidence, and used your power to intimidate anyone who challenged you. Paul stared ahead, expressionless. Your assault on your own grandson demonstrates that your abuse of power wasn't limited to your courtroom. It was who you are, a man who believes might makes right, who sees compassion as weakness, who inflicts pain without remorse. The judge paused. I've read the victim impact statements. 8 people whose lives you ruined. Families torn apart. Years stolen. And when finally confronted, you showed no remorse. Only anger that you've been caught. On the 7 counts of prosecutorial misconduct, 15 years federal prison, consecutive. On the conspiracy charges, 5 years consecutive. On the assault charges, 5 years consecutive. Total sentence, 25 years in federal prison. Given your age and health, this is effectively a life sentence. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Paul's lawyer started to object, but Paul waved him off with his working hand. Additionally, you are permanently disbarred. Your pension is revoked, and you will pay restitution to your victims totaling $3.2 million. The gavel came down. Paul was wheeled out of the courtroom, and for a moment his eyes met Calvin's. There was no anger anymore, just emptiness, the recognition that he'd lost everything. Outside the courthouse, Jordan Henderson gathered the victim families for a statement. Today, justice was finally served. Not because the system worked, the system failed us for decades. Justice came because one man, Calvin Savage, refused to let power and corruption go unchallenged. We're grateful to him and to his family for their courage. Reporters tried to get Calvin to comment, but he simply shook his head and left. That evening, Calvin sat with Kristen and Dwayne in their living room. The security cameras were still running. Calvin had decided to keep them permanently. Trust was earned slowly, lost quickly. Is it really over? Dwayne asked. Calvin considered lying, offering false comfort. But his son deserved honesty. The criminal case is over. Paul will die in prison. But there might be civil suits, appeals, people angry that we expose the corruption. We stay vigilant. I can handle vigilant, Dwayne said. You taught me that. Kristen squeezed Calvin's hand. I spoke with my mother today. She's moving to Arizona. Fresh start. She said to tell you thank you. For what? For being the man who protected us when she couldn't. Later that night, as Kristen slept, Calvin stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. His phone buzzed. A message from Anthony Lehman. Heard about the sentencing. Well done. Also heard some of Paul's friends are making noise. Want me to look into it? Calvin typed back, no. I'm done with that world. But thanks for the offer. You sure? Old skills don't fade. Might need them again. Calvin looked at his reflection in the window. Saw the man he'd become, the man he'd been, the uneasy coexistence of both. I'm sure. I got what I needed. My family is safe. That's enough. But even as he typed it, Calvin knew it wasn't entirely true. Part of him had enjoyed the hunt, the strategy, the satisfaction of watching Paul's empire crumble. That darkness Anthony referenced wasn't gone, just contained, and that scared him more than any external threat. He deleted the message thread and went to bed. 6 months later, life had found a strange new rhythm. Dwayne was thriving. The trauma had been processed through therapy, channeled into strength. He'd started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at Calvin's suggestion, learning to defend himself not through violence, but through technique and control. Calvin watched from the sidelines of the gym as Dwayne sparred with another student, a kid named Renee, coincidentally, who had good instincts but poor discipline. Your son's a natural, the instructor, Joseph May's son, ironically, who distanced himself from his father's corruption, commented. Patient, strategic, doesn't let emotion drive his choices. He learned that the hard way, Calvin said. At work, the firm had landed the Phoenix Convention Center project, delayed but not derailed by the trial. Calvin poured himself into it, finding peace in clean lines and structural integrity, creating instead of destroying. But the past had a way of creeping back. It started with a letter, forwarded from the prison where Paul was held. Calvin almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. The handwriting was shaky, affected by the stroke. Calvin, you've won. I'm here until I die. No parole. No appeals that will succeed. My name is synonymous with corruption. My legacy is destroyed. But I want you to understand something. When I beat Dwayne, it wasn't about discipline or strength. It was about you. I needed to see if the man who'd walked away from power could still access it when pushed. I needed to know if you were still the operative everyone whispered about, or if you'd gone truly soft. You proved you hadn't. And in doing so, you proved my point, that strength, real strength, requires the willingness to do terrible things. You destroyed me using the same ruthlessness I used to destroy others. We're not so different, you and I. I suspect you think about that sometimes. About how easily you went back to old methods. How natural it felt. How part of you enjoyed it. You can tell yourself you did it for Dwayne. For justice. For all my victims. But we both know the truth. You did it because you could. Because the monster never really left. You just pretended it did. I hope it haunts you like it haunted me. Paul. Calvin read the letter twice, then burned it in the sink. Watched the paper curl and blacken. But the words lingered. That night, Kristen found him in the garage, working on a birdhouse of all things. Methodical cuts. Precise angles. Building something small and harmless. You okay? Paul sent a letter from prison. What did it say? Calvin set down the saw. That I'm no different than him. That I'm a monster pretending to be normal. Kristen sat beside him. Are you asking me if that's true? Maybe. She took his hand, examining the calluses. Hands that had built homes and broken bones. Gentle and lethal, depending on context. The difference between you and my father, Kristen said slowly, is that he hurt people to feel powerful. You hurt him to stop him from hurting others. Intent matters. Context matters. Does it? I still enjoyed it. Watching him break. Knowing I had that control. Of course you did. He'd terrorized your family. Terrorized my childhood. terrorized his victims. Wanting him to suffer for that isn't monstrous, it's human. She squeezed his hand. What would be monstrous is if you'd done it to someone innocent. Or if you couldn't stop yourself from doing it again when it wasn't necessary. Calvin met her eyes. What if I can't stop? Then I'll help you. Dwayne will help you. We'll remind you who you chose to be. It was simple, direct, and somehow, exactly what Calvin needed to hear. 2 weeks later, Calvin received a call from Jordan Henderson. I wanted to give you a heads up. Paul died this morning. Calvin felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just acknowledgement. Ow! Prison fight. Another inmate, former defendant Paul prosecuted, recognized him. Attacked him in the yard. Guards broke it up, but Paul's health was already fragile. Heart attack in the infirmary. Poetic, Calvin said. Maybe. But Calvin, there's something else. Before he died, Paul made a deathbed confession. Admitted to 3 murders over the years. Witnesses in cases he was prosecuting who wouldn't cooperate. Made them look like accidents. Calvin sat down. Jesus. FBI is investigating. Might take years to sort out. But I thought you should know. You didn't destroy an innocent man. You destroyed someone much worse than any of us realized. After the call, Calvin told Kristen. Then Dwayne, who was old enough to understand complexity now. So Grandpa Paul was a murderer too, Dwayne said quietly. And you stopped him. I stopped him from hurting you. Everything else was consequence. Dad, I've been thinking about this a lot. What you did. What he did. The difference. Dwayne paused, choosing words carefully. I think the difference is that you can be dangerous and choose not to be. He was dangerous and chose to be. That's what makes you the good guy. Calvin pulled his son into a hug, surprised by how much those words meant. That weekend, the victim families held a gathering. Not a celebration. Paul's death didn't erase the damage he'd done, but a moment of acknowledgement. Closure. Marcus Henderson approached Calvin with tears in his eyes. My son, Jordan, he's got his life back. Teaching respected, because you gave us the evidence to clear my name. I can't thank you enough. You would have done the same for your family. Maybe, but I didn't have your skills, your resources, your willingness to go into darkness to bring others into light. Others echoed similar sentiments. Sally Fowler, who'd lost 5 years. Anthony Lehman, who'd nearly had his cover blown. Families who'd been torn apart. By evening's end, Calvin felt a weight lift. Not completely. He'd carry the knowledge of what he'd done, who he could become forever, but it felt more bearable. Driving home, Dwayne asked, do you regret it? What you did to him? Calvin thought about it honestly. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my son had to see that side of me. But I don't regret protecting you or bringing justice to people who deserved it. Good. Because you're still my hero, Dad. Maybe even more now. At home, Calvin received one final message. From Renee Adkins. I thought you should know, the evidence I gave you has opened up several other investigations. Paul's corruption was deeper than anyone realized. You've helped more people than you know. Thank you for having the courage to act when others wouldn't. Calvin deleted the message and put his phone away. That night, he dreamed of interrogation rooms and blueprints of violence and creation intertwined. When he woke, Kristen was beside him, Dwayne safe in the next room, and sunlight streaming through windows that no longer needed extra security cameras. The monster was still there, would always be there, but it was caged, controlled, and only released when absolutely necessary. Calvin Savage had made peace with being both the architect and the interrogator, the gentle father and the ruthless protector, the man who'd walked away from darkness and the man who'd dived back into it to save those he loved. And in that acceptance, he found something resembling peace. 3 months later, Dwayne's school held a father-son event. Calvin watched his son laugh with friends, confident and whole. Watched other fathers, Jordan Henderson among them, interact with their kids. You did good, Jordan said quietly, standing beside Calvin. With Dwayne. With all of it. Just tried to be what he needed. That's all any of us can do. On the way home, Dwayne turned to Calvin. Dad, if something like that happened again, someone threatening our family, would you do the same thing? Calvin met his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Saw not fear there, but curiosity, understanding. Without hesitation, Calvin said, "I will always protect you, by whatever means necessary." Dwayne nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I protect you too. You taught me that strength isn't about hurting people. It's about stopping those who do." And Calvin Savage, former CIA interrogator, current architect, and always a father, drove his family home knowing that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in interrogation rooms or courtrooms. They're fought in the quiet moments when you choose who you want to be. He'd made his choice 15 years ago when he left the CIA, and he'd made it again when he protected his son. The monster would always be there, lurking beneath the surface. But Calvin had learned to harness it, to use it only when necessary, and to cage it again when the threat passed. That was the real strength Paul had never understood. Not the capacity for violence, but the discipline to control it. As they pulled into the driveway, the house lit from within, Calvin felt something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. And for now, that was enough. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.